My name is Edward Sullivan, and I am 76 years old. 3 weeks ago, my grandson found an old uniform hanging in the back of my closet, and he laughed at it. Not a cruel laugh exactly, the careless kind. The kind a 14-year-old boy gives to something he doesn't understand and never thought to ask about. He held up the jacket, ran his fingers over the faded patches, and said, "Grandpa, why do you still have this old thing? It looks like something from a costume shop." What he didn't know, what none of my grandchildren knew, because I had never once explained it to them, was exactly what that uniform had cost me, and exactly what it still meant, 30 years after I'd last worn it. If you've ever had something sacred in your life dismissed by someone too young to understand its weight, stay with me, because this story isn't about anger at a boy who didn't know better. It's about the day an old man finally found the words to explain a silence he'd carried for 3 decades, and what that silence had quietly cost his entire family, without any of them ever realizing it. I need to tell you about that uniform before I tell you what happened in the closet, because you won't understand the weight of that moment otherwise, and you won't understand why one careless laugh from a boy I love more than almost anything in this world nearly broke something in me that I'd spent 30 years carefully holding together. I grew up in a small town in western Pennsylvania, the kind of place where the mill defined everything: who worked, who didn't, who left, who stayed, whose lungs gave out first, and whose held on a little longer. My father worked that mill for 31 years until his lungs finally gave out entirely, the way so many men's did in that town, coughing themselves into hospital beds that smelled like bleach and inevitability. I watched him shrink over the course of 2 years, this large, capable man who had once carried me on his shoulders through the town's 4th of July parade, reduced to something small and gasping in a bed that seemed too big for what remained of him. I enlisted in the Marine Corps at 19, mostly because I didn't want to end up coughing in a hospital bed the way he did, and partly because something in me wanted to prove I could survive something harder than a mill floor, something that would let me leave that dying town on my own terms, rather than watching it slowly bury me the way it had buried him. My mother cried the day I left for boot camp. My father, weak as he already was by then, shook my hand at the bus station and told me, in the closest thing to an emotional statement I ever heard him make, that he was proud of me for choosing something different than what had been chosen for him. I served 8 years, 2 combat deployments. I don't talk about the specifics much, even now, even to people who ask directly, because some things don't translate into words that land the same way they lived in your body. There's a particular kind of knowledge that combat gives you, a knowledge that lives somewhere below language, in the reflexes of your hands, and the way certain sounds still make your shoulders tense, even 50 years later. I came home in my late 20s, married a woman named Margaret who I'd known since high school, back when she used to sit 2 rows behind me in Mrs. Anderson's English class and pass notes about books neither of us particularly liked, and built a quiet life as a machinist, the same trade half the men in that dying mill town eventually turned to once the mill itself closed for good, taking with it whatever remained of the town's original purpose. Margaret and I had 2 children, my daughter Christine and my son Michael, who is the father of the grandson in this story, a boy named Tyler. Margaret passed 9 years ago, cancer, the slow kind that gives you time to say goodbye, but somehow makes the goodbye harder because you have to say it more than once, in a dozen small moments spread across months, rather than all at once in a single clean cut. Since then, I've lived alone in the same house we bought 40 years ago, the closet in the back bedroom still holding, among other things, one uniform I never once got rid of, though I hadn't taken it out of that closet in longer than I could remember, not even to look at it, not even on the anniversaries that still mattered to me more than I ever let on. I want to be honest about something. I never talked about my service much, not because I was ashamed of it, but because I never found a way to talk about it that didn't feel like either bragging or opening a door I wasn't sure I wanted opened all the way, not even for myself. Margaret understood this about me without ever needing it explained. In 42 years of marriage, she asked me about the war exactly 3 times, and each time, when she saw the particular stillness that came over my face, she simply took my hand and let the silence sit there instead, understanding somehow that some silences are a kind of honesty too. Michael grew up knowing his father had served in the Marines. That was about the extent of it. I never sat him down and explained what those years actually held. When he was young, if he asked, I'd give him a short, safe answer. I served my country, son, and I'm glad I did. And then find some reason to change the subject, usually by asking about his homework or his baseball practice. The ordinary currency of fatherhood that let both of us avoid the harder conversation neither of us quite knew how to have. And by the time Tyler came along, 12 years ago, the uniform in my closet had become, to my own family, little more than an old piece of fabric nobody ever asked about, a relic so thoroughly unremarked upon that it had, in a strange way, become almost invisible, even to me. I don't blame them for that. I built that silence myself, one quiet decade at a time, laying brick after brick of careful avoidance until the wall between my service and my family's understanding of it had grown taller than any of us fully realized. 3 weeks ago, Tyler came to stay with me for a week while Michael and his wife took a trip for their anniversary. Tyler is 14 now, at that particular age where boys are curious about everything and respectful of very little. Not out of malice, just out of the particular carelessness that comes before you've lived long enough to understand what things actually cost. He's a good kid, genuinely. Quick-witted, kind to his younger cousins, the kind of boy who still hugs his grandfather goodbye without being embarrassed about it in front of his friends, which at 14 is no small thing. On the third day of his stay, I was out in the garage working on an old lawnmower engine, the kind of small, satisfying repair work that had always helped me think, and Tyler was up in the house, apparently exploring, the way kids do in a house that isn't fully theirs, opening drawers and closets with the easy curiosity of someone who has never once been told there's anything worth hiding. When I came back inside for lunch, wiping engine grease from my hands with an old rag, I found him in my bedroom, the closet door open, my old uniform jacket in his hands, holding it up against himself like he was trying it on for size, admiring himself in the mirror on the back of the closet door. "Grandpa," he said, grinning, not looking up right away, still turning slightly to see how the jacket hung on his narrow shoulders. "Why do you still have this old thing? It looks like something from a costume shop. Did you dress up as a soldier for Halloween or something back in the day?" He laughed. Not meanly, just the easy laugh of a boy who genuinely didn't know any better, who had never once been told what he was holding, who had grown up in a house, my son's house, where this particular piece of history had simply never been given the weight it deserved. I stood in that doorway for a moment, and I felt something rise in my chest that surprised me with its intensity. Not anger at him, not really, but a kind of grief for 30 years of silence that had left my own grandson standing there with no idea what he was holding in his hands. It was a strange, disorienting feeling, watching a boy I loved so completely treat something so sacred to me with the same casual amusement he might give an old Halloween costume found in an attic. "That's not a costume, Tyler," I said, and my voice must have carried something in it, because his grin faded immediately, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "That's a Marine Corps uniform, my uniform, from when I served." "Oh," he said, suddenly uncertain, lowering the jacket slightly, his hands going still on the fabric. "I didn't know you were actually in the military, Grandpa. I mean, I knew you were, kind of, but I didn't really think about it, I guess. Dad's mentioned it before, but it always seemed like, I don't know, something from a long time ago that didn't really connect to anything. That sentence, 'I didn't really think about it,' sat with me the rest of that day in a way I hadn't expected. Not because it was cruel, because it was honest, and because it revealed something about my own failure, as much as his lack of awareness. I had spent so many years protecting my grandchildren from the weight of what that uniform represented, telling myself I was sparing them something difficult, that I had, without meaning to, taught them it didn't carry any weight at all. I had turned my own history into background noise, so quiet it had become inaudible. I didn't say much more in that moment. I took the jacket from him gently, careful not to make him feel worse than he already visibly did, and hung it back in the closet, smoothing the shoulders the way I used to when I still wore it regularly. I told him lunch was ready, and we ate mostly in silence, Tyler glancing at me occasionally with the particular wariness of a kid who knows he's stumbled into something he doesn't understand, but can sense is important. That night, after Tyler had gone to bed, I sat alone in my kitchen for a long time, the same kitchen table Margaret and I had eaten 1,000 meals at, looking at nothing in particular, turning the day's small moment over and over in my mind. I made a decision I'd been avoiding for 30 years. I decided it was time to finally explain. The next morning, over breakfast, I asked Tyler if he'd sit with me for a while after we ate. He looked a little nervous, the way kids do when they sense they're in trouble but aren't sure exactly why. I told him he wasn't in trouble. I told him I wanted to show him something and tell him a story I'd never told anyone in our family, not even his father, and that I needed him to listen carefully because it mattered more than almost anything else I'd ever tried to teach him. I brought the uniform out of the closet and laid it carefully across the kitchen table, smoothing out the fabric with the same deliberate care I'd give to a piece of fine machinery. Tyler sat across from me, quiet now, watching my face the way kids do when they realize an adult is about to say something that matters, something that requires their full attention rather than the distracted half-listening most conversations get from a 14-year-old. "This uniform," I said, "isn't a costume, and it isn't just an old jacket, Tyler. This uniform is the only physical thing I have left from 8 years of my life that changed who I was, in ways I've never fully found the words to explain to anyone, including myself some days." I told him about enlisting at 19, about a father who died young from a life spent in a mill, about wanting to prove to myself I could survive something harder. I told him about boot camp, about the particular kind of breaking down and building back up that the Marine Corps does to a young man, stripping away everything soft until only the essential parts remain, and then rebuilding those parts into something disciplined and durable, something that could be relied upon by the men standing beside him when it mattered most. I told him, carefully, in pieces I'd never assembled out loud before, about my first deployment. Not the specific horrors, some things a 14-year-old doesn't need in detail, and some things I still don't have full words for even at 76, even after decades of trying, in the quiet of my own mind, to find language adequate to what I'd witnessed. But I told him about carrying men who didn't make it home the same distance I made it home. I told him about the particular silence of a transport plane full of young men who understood, without needing to say it aloud, that they were not the same people who had boarded a similar plane months earlier. I told him about a friend named Daniel Reyes, who I served 2 tours alongside, who didn't come back from the second one, and whose name I still say quietly to myself every November on the anniversary of the day we lost him. Daniel had been from Texas, the son of migrant farm workers, the first in his family to finish high school, let alone serve his country. He used to talk, endlessly, about the diner he wanted to open someday, a small place that served his mother's recipes alongside American classics, a bridge between the two worlds he'd grown up straddling. He never got the chance to open that diner. He never got the chance to grow old enough to have grandchildren of his own who might one day find his own uniform in a closet somewhere. "This patch," I said, pointing to a specific insignia on the jacket's shoulder, my finger tracing its faded edges, "isn't decoration, Tyler. This is a unit patch. It means I served with a specific group of men, in a specific place, doing something that asked more of us than most people are ever asked to give. Every one of these patches has a story behind it. Most of those stories I've never told anyone, because for a long time I didn't think anyone wanted to hear them, or that I had the right words to make people understand what they meant." Tyler was quiet, really quiet, in a way I hadn't seen from him before. He reached out, hesitantly, and touched the fabric of the jacket, more carefully this time, his fingers moving slowly over the patches, as though he could somehow feel the weight of what they represented through his fingertips. "Grandpa," he said, "why didn't you ever tell us any of this before? Dad never talks about it either." I don't know, I guess I thought it was just something that happened a long time ago that didn't really matter anymore. Like it was just a fact about you, not something that was actually, like, real. That question hit me harder than I expected it to, harder than almost anything anyone had said to me in years. I think, I said slowly, choosing my words the way I'd choose the placement of a delicate part in an engine, testing each one before committing to it. I stopped talking about it because for a long time, coming home from something like that, the world moves on so fast around you. Nobody really wants to hear the hard parts, and the parts that aren't hard don't seem worth mentioning on their own, so I just stopped talking about it altogether. And I think, somewhere along the way, my silence taught your father that it wasn't something worth asking about. And his silence taught you the same thing. That's not your fault, Tyler. That's on me. I built that silence, one quiet year at a time, and I never stopped to think about what it would cost, until you were standing in my closet holding this jacket like it was a Halloween costume. Tyler's eyes were wet now, and he didn't try to hide it, which told me something about the kind of young man he was actually turning into, underneath the ordinary teenage carelessness that so often masks a deeper thoughtfulness. "I'm sorry, Grandpa," he said, his voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. "I didn't mean it like, I wasn't trying to disrespect you. I just genuinely didn't know. If I'd known, I never would have said that stuff about a costume shop." "I know you didn't mean it that way," I said. "And that's exactly why I'm telling you now. Because I'd rather you understand what you're looking at than spend the rest of your life not knowing what your own grandfather actually carried. And I'd rather you learn it from me, in my own words, than never learn it at all." We sat at that table for almost 3 hours. I told him about coming home, about the strange quiet of civilian life after years of a world where every decision carried immediate weight, where the wrong choice in a split second could mean the difference between a man going home to his family or not. I told him about the disorienting first months back, when ordinary sounds, a car backfiring, a door slamming too hard, would send my body into a state of alertness my mind hadn't asked for and couldn't entirely control. I told him about meeting his grandmother, about how she was the first person who ever made the silence feel less heavy, without ever needing me to explain it fully, simply by sitting beside me in it. I told him about the mill town, about watching it die slowly over decades, the storefronts going dark one by one along Main Street, about choosing to become a machinist because it was honest work with my hands, work that let me build something instead of just enduring something, a way of channeling the discipline the Marine Corps had instilled in me towards something quietly constructive rather than destructive. I showed him old photographs I'd kept in a box in that same closet. Young men in fatigues, squinting into bright sun in places whose names most people my age still remember with a particular kind of ache. Places that show up now mostly in history textbooks that flatten decades of individual grief into a few paragraphs and a map. I pointed out Daniel Reyes in one photograph, laughing at something just out of frame, 22 years old forever now, frozen in a moment of genuine happiness that never got the chance to accumulate into the decades of ordinary happiness he deserved. "He never got to grow old, Tyler," I said. "He never got to have a grandson ask him questions about an old uniform in a closet. I did get that. I got 50 more years he never got. So when I tell you this story, I'm not just telling it for me. I'm telling it for him too, in a way. Every time I explain what this patch means, I'm making sure somebody remembers that he existed, that he mattered, that the 8 years I spent in that uniform weren't just mine alone to carry." Tyler didn't say much after that. He just sat with it, the way a 14-year-old sits with something too large to fully process in one sitting, which is exactly as it should be. Sometimes the most respectful thing a young person can do with a heavy truth is simply let it sit heavy for a while, rather than rushing to fill the silence with reassurance they don't yet have the life experience to offer honestly. That evening before bed, he asked if he could take a photograph of the uniform, just to have it. I said yes. Then he asked something that surprised me. "Grandpa, would it be okay if I told my friends about this, like at school? I don't want to make it into something weird, but I think people should know. I think I want people to know what my grandfather actually did, and I think I want to know how to tell it right, so it doesn't sound like just some old war story. I want to tell it the way you told me." I told him that would be all right, more than all right. I told him that the greatest honor he could give Daniel Reyes, and every other man I'd served alongside who didn't make it home, was simply to make sure their names, and what they gave, didn't disappear entirely into silence the way I'd almost let them. 2 weeks later, Michael called me, and I could hear something different in his voice right away. An unfamiliar rawness that told me the conversation had already started before he'd even said hello properly. "Dad," he said, "Tyler's been talking about you nonstop since he got home. He told me things about your service I never knew, Dad. Details about Daniel Reyes, about boot camp, about coming home, about the sounds that used to startle you. Why did you tell him all of this and never tell me? I'm 46 years old, and I just found out things about my own father from my 14-year-old son." I sat with that question for a moment, feeling the weight of 30 years of silence sitting between me and my own son. A silence I now understood had cost him something too, something I'd never fully considered before Tyler's careless laugh had cracked it open. "Because he asked me a question I didn't have a good answer for," I said. "He asked me why I never told any of you before, and once I heard myself trying to explain the silence, I realized I didn't have a good enough reason to keep it going any longer. I think, Michael, I've been protecting all of you from something you never actually needed protecting from. I think I convinced myself, somewhere along the way, that my service was something to carry quietly and alone, rather than something worth sharing with the people I love most. And I think, if I'm honest with myself, some part of me was also protecting myself, keeping the door closed because opening it meant feeling things I'd spent decades learning how not to feel in front of other people." "Dad," Michael said, and his voice cracked slightly, "I'd like to hear it too. All of it, if you're willing to tell me. I'm 46 years old, and I realize I know almost nothing about 8 of the most important years of my own father's life. I've spent my whole life thinking of you as just Dad, the guy who fixed my bike and taught me to drive, and I never once really thought of you as someone who lived through something like that. I want to know you better, Dad, before it's too late for either of us." We had that conversation 2 weeks later, over a Sunday dinner, with Tyler sitting beside his father, listening again to parts of the story he'd already heard, nodding along like someone helping tell a story he now considered partly his own to carry too, occasionally adding a detail he remembered from our first conversation that I'd forgotten to mention the second time around. Something has shifted in our family since that afternoon in the kitchen. Michael has started asking questions he never thought to ask before, calling more often just to talk, not about logistics or scheduling, but about my life, my memories, the things that made me who I am. Christine, my daughter, called after hearing about it from Michael, her voice thick with emotion, and asked if she could bring her own children to visit soon, so I could tell them the same story before. As she put it, gently but honestly, we run out of time to hear it properly. Tyler wears a small pin now, a replica of that unit insignia, that I gave him the week after our conversation, not the original uniform, which stays carefully preserved in a proper display case I finally purchased instead of a closet, but a smaller token he can carry with him, a reminder of a story he now understands he's part of continuing. Last week, Tyler asked if he could bring the uniform, carefully, to a school project about family history. I said yes, on the condition that he tell it accurately, tell it with the weight it deserves, not as a costume story, but as what it actually was. He promised he would. I believe him. He spent 3 evenings at my kitchen table afterward, taking notes, asking careful follow-up questions, making sure he understood every detail well enough to honor it properly in front of his classmates. I don't tell you this story because I want sympathy for an old man whose grandson didn't understand an old jacket. I tell you this story because I want you to understand something important. Silence, even well-intentioned silence, has a cost. The things we carry quietly, thinking we're protecting the people we love from a weight we don't want to burden them with, often end up teaching those same people that the weight doesn't matter at all. Sometimes the most important thing you can do for the people who come after you is simply to finally say the thing you've been carrying alone for 30 years, before a careless laugh or an empty chair at a family dinner makes that choice for you instead. That uniform hung in my closet, unexplained, for 3 decades. It took one careless laugh from a 14-year-old boy to finally open the door I should have opened a long time ago. I'm grateful, now, that he laughed. because it gave me the chance, finally, to make sure the story doesn't end with me, and to make sure that a name like Daniel Reyes doesn't quietly disappear from memory simply because I was too tired, or too afraid, to say it out loud. If this story reminded you of something in your own family that's been carried in silence for too long, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and consider being the one who finally breaks that silence, before it's too late to be heard, and before the people who love you are left, like my grandson once was, holding something precious, with no idea what they're actually holding.